All right, so this video is going to explain a little bit on how to get files ready for 3D printing on TinkerCAD because it's pretty straightforward, but there are some things you're going to want to hit before you actually do export it. So one, you're going to want to change this name most likely. I would change it to something descriptive, right? So I just put a little default table there with something on it. So let's just name it like table or something. Okay, so change the name is the first part. Two, so in TinkerCAD, you've created an object. You need to make sure that there's no gaps in your object. And what I mean by this is, sometimes when you're going to 3D print this, there might be a slightly small gap. Okay, so I may not notice this. This is why it's important to get up close and inspect it before you 3D print. The reason being is how 3D printers work. It builds everything up layer by layer, kind of like putting toothpaste on a toothbrush over and over again. It goes up, 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 up. And it's going to get to this. It's going to get to the top of your table here. And it's going to see that it has the cone to print. Okay? But it also sees this gap. So what's going to happen is it's going to build support material on here that's meant to be broken off, and then it's going to build the cone. So what's going to end up happening is this will print, and this will probably work, but between the cone and the table is going to be really weak support material that it thinks is supposed to be broken off, which means your cone's going to break off the top. So you need to go around, I would need to fix this by, dragging the cone down into the table. That way it's all one object again, okay? If you don't do that, your cone would break off. You want to look at everything. So I'm looking at everything. That looks pretty good. Okay, there's no like visible gaps that I see that are big enough to cause problems. But you need to make sure you have no gaps. So the other thing when you look for when 3D printing is overhangs. Okay, 3D printers will be able to print objects straight up from the ground. And let's think about this logically. If I'm 3D printing, and this is the 3D printer, right? It's printing the legs. It's printing, we're going up the legs, up the legs, up the legs, up the legs, and it goes like this. It gets to the top of the legs. Now just think here, how is the 3D printer going to print this line of filament and not have the filament flowing to the bottom because of gravity? Well, the answer is that, one, it's not going to unless you tell it. This will break the print if I leave it like this. Now, there are ways to compensate for this in 3D printer, but it's not our first line of defense here. So what I would do is just take a look at how this object is. So this object needs to be printed. This might not be the best way to do it. So let's take a look at what this looks like on its side at 9 degrees. Now I'm just thinking of the 3D printer. I'm still going to need a lot of support material here. Okay, so that doesn't really work too well. Turning this upside down. Whoops, I forgot a leg there. Let me group this together. Turn it upside down may be a little bit better, but you should always be careful because printing something like this, it's never going to stick on the 3D printer. So for this object, it is probably best to print it like this. Okay, if I was going to 3D print some sort of L-shaped object, like let's look at something like this. Like this, or a T-shape, let's go with. Okay, this is definitely not the way to print it because you're going to require support material that's on here that you have to break off, which is a waste of plastic. This is definitely not the way to print it because then you need support material on both sides. But look at this. If I go like this and rotate like that, I don't need any support material because I'm going to print the bottom, the bottom, the bottom, the bottom. It gets to the top, everything's good. And then it prints this all the way to the top. No support material required. So make sure before you submit this for 3D printing, you orientate everything as best you think it should be. Okay? So that's that. Step 2, make sure your objects are on the ground. So look at how this is floating, that's not. What I would do is I'm going to group these together before I do this. Make sure they're all flat on the work plane, or at least on the same plane. So that's not on the same plane. So I'm going to use the align tool to align everything to the bottom. Okay, that's the second step. You can't have things on different heights. It'll screw things up. Okay. Most of the time, you're going to be printing one object. It's rare that you will print several objects that are different, because it just works better to print one object at a time, okay? But if it's part of the print, that's okay. However, what you don't want, and you may have seen it, do not forget about any objects that may be out here that you don't want to print. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've seen this, where I go to 3D print, and I'm getting some sort of weird error, and it turns out you forgot something out here. Because what happens is, when you make this a STL file, it groups everything together, and I cannot edit it anymore. So it would basically look like this. I'd have this going on, and they would all be grouped together like this. Well, that's not going to work because there's so much distance between here, I can't even put this in the 3D printing software. So don't forget to check your area, delete any errant shapes. Okay, look around. All right. So far we have renamed it, checked for any gaps, orientated everything as best we could, check for errant pieces. Now the only thing we have to do is come up here and go to export, and you're going to go to .stl. Okay. After that, you can feel free to send the print to wherever you need to send it to, but that is how you get ready and export for 3D printing.